Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Liu. I'm the Executive Director of the School of Cities. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first in our Knowledge Cafe talks. But before we start, I'd wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. And I realize that you are not all in Toronto, so I encourage you to take some time to learn about the land upon which you are living and working. But for us here in Toronto, and for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today is a meeting place. This meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The purpose of the School of Cities Knowledge Cafe series of talks is to highlight and to give voice to scholars from a range of disciplines to talk about their work on urban issues. And we're committed not only to the diversity of people and the diversity of disciplines, but also in the diversity in ways of knowing. And especially on this is the eve of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We're reminded to consider and include Indigenous ways of knowing in our work in academia, and the wisdom and insights that are embedded in community practice and the deep relationship to the land and the natural world, which is particularly relevant today because today's topic will be on climate change, arguably one of the most pressing challenges of our time. So I am excited to welcome the School of Cities inaugural director, Professor Karen Chapple. Karen is a professor of geography and planning at the University of Toronto, and most recently professor emerita at the University of California at Berkeley, where she was chair of city and regional planning. Professor Chapple, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming to our first Knowledge Cafe. We reached out to a number of folks to speak, and we have a wonderful series lined up for the whole year. We couldn't find anybody, though, to speak today, so I, by default, became today's speaker, which is fine because this is an issue which is really dear to my heart. And it, in fact, is the theme of the School Cities in our inaugural year, climate, justice, and cities. I'm just going to give a quick announcement before we start about our Urban Challenge grants. We've just launched this new grant program. It's Urban Challenge 2.0 grant program because it's building on a previous research grant program we had. It's flexible funding to launch a new area of research in climate justice, or even just finish up an old project. But what we care about, first of all, is that your work is multidisciplinary. And secondly, we're particularly interested to see work that is going to be connected to real world events, and so they can be translated for policymakers readily. So the deadline is just in about 3 weeks now, and we're looking to see a lot of proposals. We're hoping faculty and postdocs are going to be applying, and we're also encouraging faculty to submit applications jointly with their PhD students. So we're hoping to have a lot of new activity around climate justice and cities through this, both the speaker series and the research grant program. So I'm going to jump into my talk for today. I call this talk Double Jeopardy, actually, because we're in jeopardy because of climate change occurring around us, but we're also potentially in jeopardy because certain communities might be particularly vulnerable to the mitigation measures that we use to reduce global warming. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I want to start with a story about a community fighting development in the neighborhood. And this is a very familiar story, I think, to all of us. We've all seen how communities mobilize to stop new development. What is interesting here is that this is new development that is considered part of California's climate change mitigation plan. So it's a new infill development, 400 units next to the Los Angeles River, which is being restored. And you could see the site here and the plans for the Los Angeles River. And what it's interesting to think of the analogies actually to Toronto, because Los Angeles River was channelized a century ago, and now we're trying to restore access to the river, just in the way we're trying to restore access to the Don River, which was also channelized. And there's been a massive long-term effort then to restore access to the river and to restore parks around the river, and then to build infill development. But as you can see here in this narrative, which comes from a media article from just this year, the community is resisting this development for several reasons, actually. First of all, the developers offering just 8% subsidized affordable units. In a city where it's more typical to have 20% inclusionary, this particular development is not subject to the city's inclusionary housing law, so it didn't have to comply with it. It volunteered to do 8% affordable units, but that's not very many, 35 new units. And then the other major objection, you can see here at the end here, it's a stretch of land that provides valuable access to nature. So people have been using the land next to the river for decades, and they've become accustomed to recreating without having kind of formal recreation facilities. They use the space just like we all use underutilized public spaces in our cities. And so these are the objections. Now, we did some interviews in the area, and this is the voice of an organizer from the Southeast Asian Community Alliance. And I thought this was a particularly powerful quote about green gentrification. So this organizer says, you see all these beautiful renderings of parks and people riding bikes, kayaking. And we're saying, where are we in this? My family are garment workers and making $15,000 a year, and the rents are more than we can make. Where are we going to go? Should we fight against more parks, or do we just give up? We can't say no to parks, but we can't assume that saying yes to parks has to mean gentrification, displacement. There has to be a third option. So this is the part of the community resistance, and then of course some of the community resistance is just what you would call standard NIMBYism. It's the homeowners in the area that are just trying to stop any new units because of traffic and parking concerns, etc. But what's interesting here is that both sides of this debate, and by sides I mean here the community, and then on the other side, the city of Los Angeles and the developers, both are claiming justice, that they are doing just interventions. So this takes several different forms. The first is distributive justice. So from the city's perspective, providing these new green amenities in a disinvested neighborhood is bringing tremendous benefits. The city says, hey, we're giving you health benefits, we're giving you economic development benefits, new jobs, and we're giving you a beautiful park. From the developer's perspective, he's giving a disinvested neighborhood 8% affordable housing. So he feels like that is a giveaway. And but of course, from the community's perspective, there's a distributive injustice. So they say, well, you're bringing the park and creating green gentrification, which could displace our vulnerable residents. There's also a debate here about recognition justice. So from the city's perspective, bringing this huge new green infrastructure project is bringing symbolic justice for the neighborhood. This neighborhood is finally attracting those wonderful amenities that are associated with high income areas. And you see this kind of logic also with interventions like the High Line in New York. Beautiful park in an area that really had none before. So that's a symbolic recognition. From the community perspective, this is just basically colonialism in there, and bringing these outside amenities in, and it's not acknowledging their everyday practices of how they use their own open space, so that the community sees this basically as white supremacy. And then there's procedural justice. So there's a debate here as well. So from the city's perspective and the developer's perspective, there's lots of opportunities here for public participation. There's public hearings, there's an environmental review process, and you can come in and voice your thoughts. But from the community's perspective, they're basically being confronted with a fait accompli. Here's what we're going to do. The input is not meaningful, it's just consultation. So this is a very familiar story. This is planning as how it's done today. This is the state of the art in planning. And we see this in community after community, and battle after battle. So the question is, can we do better than this? Can we move beyond this debate? And I argue that we can, and I argue that we can do it by empowering communities with data. So I believe that there is a role for our positivist models, a role for all of our data, but only if it's coupled with meaningful community co-creation and community organizing. So I want to talk a little bit more today about this case, about our data on it, and then about what the community can do with it. So here's where we started, and this is where we're coming from. So when planners land in a community and are trying to do infill development today, they're confronting a legacy of the 20th century. And in the US, this took the form of urban renewal, and it also took the form of the Interstate Highway Act, and both of those tore apart communities, traumatized the neighborhoods, and created tremendous distrust of government. And this, of course, happened in Toronto as well, and you see it over the battles over the Gardiner Expressway, which cut the community off from its waterfront, and other battles as well. This is a photo of Robert Moses, who was the architect of a lot of this urban renewal in New York, and this is cultural gentrification. And I just love these ballerinas that they brought up here to celebrate how the Lincoln Center, this cultural institution, was going to displace 7,000 families in that vital West Side New York neighborhood. So this experience, it still frames our actions today in cities. And even though we're at a transformative moment, that legacy hangs over us. And so things have changed since Robert Moses tried to bulldoze cities to bring the middle class back. How have things changed? Well, the city actually did come back, starting really in the late 1970s and later in some areas, but you started to see comeback cities, and you saw actually that this phenomenon called gentrification, this influx of high-income, high-educated newcomers, an influx of capital, was now happening all around the world, as in Loretta Lee's aptly named book, Planetary Gentrification. So this is, this phenomenon is now recognizable all over the world. So this has been well established. What's new now is what people are calling green gentrification. And this is the idea that the parks, the transit lines, the amenities we're bringing in to support urban living, to facilitate infill development, are themselves actually displacing vulnerable communities that still live in the core. We started working on this phenomenon about 15 years ago, thinking about transit investments in the state of California. There are 700 new transit stations planned for the state of California. It's a massive expansion of transit. It is smart growth, and it's a state trying to recover from its wholesale adoption of a sprawling land use pattern. Now California has figured out that in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it needs to move to a more compact urban form, and transit is going to be one key to how we do this. So we wrote this book. We looked at San Francisco and Los Angeles. We studied the effects where transit investment was occurring. We looked at what was the gentrification that was occurring, what was the displacement that was occurring. And what we found in the book was that basically it varied a lot across communities. We went in thinking that transit was going to simply instigate a process of land value uplift and subsequent rent increases and displacement of the communities. It actually turned out that impacts were very mixed. That in some areas, depending on how walkable they were, how many amenities were there, what kinds of stores were there, you would see lots of land value increases, rent increases, displacement, and others not at all. So our answer to this question is there transit-oriented displacement, or are there community dividends? The answer actually turns out to be, it depends. It depends on context. It depends on very local factors of who the community is, what the urban form is, etc. My joke here is that we actually had to make the book available for free because nobody wants to read a book that says it depends. But it is still free at MIT Press. Okay, so going back to our more recent research, we decided to look more broadly. So we had our database of transit investments. We decided we should also look at all of the different types of investments the state of California was making for in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so California has been working on its climate program, like Canada, for 20 odd years, has a cap and trade program, has targets to meet to get emissions down to 1990 levels and below, and so that program includes a lot of revenues going towards different forms of mitigation. So the cap and trade program itself has yielded about $9 billion for a variety of different climate investments. There's also transit money, and that's mostly in the US from the federal government, and here Canada as well, I believe, drops down from the federal government, tons of money for transit. Then California has also taxed itself. It's issued many different bonds that have supported infill development, infill infrastructure, parks, affordable housing development around transit, and so forth. And so this adds up to a lot of money, or really a massive program that really needs to be studied right away. So that was our role. So we compiled a list of about 1,400 climate investments. This is representing about $23 billion in funding. The whole project costs of these projects were $173 billion. And this is just in 3 regions within the state of California. So these were all we could find, all of the active transportation investments, all of the transit investments, all of the mixed income transit-oriented development, subsidized housing, all of the urban greening and parks investments. We compiled the list. We ran some models. We worked along the way with community groups in the 3 regions who helped us ground truth our results, helped us validate our data, helped critique our approach, said, you're missing that variable, you need to look at that variable, and also wrote case studies of their own neighborhoods in their regions. We had the advantage of having infogroup proprietary data. One of the reasons people don't really study this issue very much is they often don't have data on individual households. They just have census data on neighborhoods. We were able to look at how individual households are moving to really measure what was the impact of these investments. Was there disproportionate amount of people moving out when you had those investments occurring? We used descriptives, we used propensity score matching to get matched pairs, and then we ran linear probability models and did some case studies, and this is my team at Berkeley. So these are our matched pairs that we used in our regions, and so we tried to find areas that were similar in terms of income, in terms of racial ethnic composition, in terms of education level, in terms of recent change. So controlling for all those factors to see whether our investments had an impact. So I'm just going to summarize some of the results that we see, and then talk a little bit about the implications. So this is a chart which looks at different regions. And so just to orient you to what we're seeing here. So we had our investments, those are in light green. We had our controls, those were our matched pairs, those are in dark green. And what we're looking at is outmigration rates. So what we're looking at is the share of households that move out in any given year. And what you can see here, the light green, again, is where our investments are. And what you can see is that in some regions, we have higher outmigration rates associated with investments with the light green. So on the left, Fresno and Los Angeles have higher outmigration when there's an investment. On the right, Sacramento and San Francisco, you have generally lower outmigration rates when there's an investment. So that was our first kind of aha. It depends on the context. So then we dug down and looked at income levels. So again, what we're looking at is very low income to high income households. So the first chart is those that are 0 to 30% area median income. So these are people on a very, very low income. And we generally don't see much difference between migration rates, whether there's an investment or not. Maybe slightly higher actually where there is no investment in our control neighborhoods. We see for the next two income groups, 30 to 50%, 50 to 80% AMI, still quite low income. We see that there's a slightly higher outmigration rate associated with those investments. And same thing with on the bottom two charts, the moderate income on the left have often in many years a higher outmigration rate where there's an investment. And the highest income also have in some years a higher outmigration rate. So this actually surprised us again. We were expecting to find actually that there would be a lot more outmigration where there was an investment. This is an indicator that actually the green gentrification is not displacing households in the way that they fear. So this was sort of a good news story, but then let's look at the models. So that was just the descriptive analysis. Then we ran some models. Again, the lighter green is where there's an investment happening. The darker green are the controls. And on the left are where there's transit investments, and on the right are where there are active transportation or park investments. So here, once we controlling for a number of different factors, demographic factors, economic factors, business cycle factors, which we control for by year fixed effects models, we can see that for certain communities, there is a pronounced higher outmigration rate for when you do an investment. And this is not for the extremely low income on the top panel, but the very low and low income do experience this outmigration impact. And it's particularly occurring with parks. So that was validating what the community felt they were seeing on the ground. Going back to our specific case of the Los Angeles River, we pulled the data for those communities, and we looked over time to see what was the change for low income renters in these neighborhoods. So in general, so the top line is dark blue, that's the mobility rate for all families. In general, the number of families, I'm sorry, this is the net migration rate. So this is just the total number of families in the neighborhood. In general, the number of families is going up in these areas. If you look at low income renter movers, that's the dotted line. And what we see is actually a slight increase and then a decrease. So in this actual area, we're not really seeing that much outmigration. It is a few families, and but what we're seeing a lot of is replacement. So what we're seeing is that low income families are moving out, but then they're also moving in. So this is an interesting phenomenon, and we went back to our community groups to ask them, what are we seeing here? What does this, how does this resonate with your experience? And what they said to us was, well, that's funny, because I know when my neighbor moves out, I don't see him around anymore, but I don't really know the new people in the neighborhood, whether they have moved in permanently or they're just visiting. So I don't really know that, I don't really notice the replacement effect. This experience of displacement is very, very real. The full picture of neighborhood change doesn't really come out until you go to the secondary data. So I'm going to jump to some policy thoughts and then open it up for discussion. I know I've thrown a lot out on the table in a very short time period. So what we find in our work is that if you're looking at climate change mitigation in the form of active transportation, greening, and transit investments, the outmigration effects are quite small and they are contextually specific. What is interesting here is that they are thus probably mitigable. So if you look at actual, the numbers that we're seeing, we saw increases of about 1%. So in a typical year, you have 10% of households move out. When you put a park in, you have 11% moving out instead of 10% in that neighborhood. So if you have 400 households in that neighborhood, and 40 typically move out in a year, this means that 44 would be moving out instead. And so if you think about this then over a 10-year period, 4 households a year, 40 households. So you need 40 housing units basically to mitigate that park. This is the first time that I know of that anybody has put a number to this, how much mitigation we need to do. So it makes it super interesting. And when we brought this back to the community, and discussed, what would be the policy that they would want to see the state of California adopt, the idea of community land trusts kept coming up as a policy that would actually be viable. Because if you could buy one existing apartment building, or if you could buy one vacant lot and build a new subsidized apartment building, you could basically mitigate the effects of green gentrification. Now, that said, if the city does this without actually giving the community a real role, the community will still be fighting this. And so one of the things that we really need to think about is how to engage communities in this kind of mitigation process in a co-design kind of role. And think about then also, since we know very little about what's going to happen beyond a 10-year period, beyond a 20-year period or 30-year period, we need to also be thinking about how to organize these communities so that if change does pick up, if it accelerates, they have the capacity then to react and to advocate for changes that will keep them in the neighborhood. So what we have done in our work is create tools, and this is our latest tool that we created for this project. And it's so recent that we haven't even launched it yet, but in a month or so, it will be up on our website. And so this is a tool where we map all of the community investments that are occurring through California's climate change program. We map the transit, we map the parks, and then we provide data on mobility rates around those improvements so that communities can look for themselves at how households of different income groups are reacting to the new investment. And what we've found in the past is that when we give communities tools like this, when we just slap our maps and visualizations up on the web, we get actions like this. So this man at the San Jose City Council is taking our maps, which are showing neighborhood change on the ground, and bringing them to his city councilors to say, hey, our neighborhood is changing. You need to put some policies in place to stabilize the community and make sure my family doesn't get pushed out. And in this case, San Jose did respond and enacted some anti-displacement measures. So these can be really powerful tools that validate and legitimate the experiences of community members on the ground. So coming back to the idea of justice and justice in greening, so how can we get beyond the limitations of the debates over justice that communities seem to be stuck in, and cities as well? So I would argue that there are different ways to think about justice that are very productive and could lead to more of a productive debate about how we are going to adapt our cities to climate change. And I draw here from this article, which just came out in the Annals last year, Expanding the Boundaries of Justice in Urban Greening Scholarship, by Isabel Angelovsky at Barcelona, and Anna Brand, who not only is a professor at Berkeley, but is renting my house in Berkeley right now. So I was amused to see her name on this as well. But this article has a lot of fabulous ideas about how we can rethink our greening interventions to be more reparative and to be more restorative. So trying to make sure that as we plan these interventions, as we plan new transit lines, as we plan new parks, that we are conscious about structural inequalities in the communities that we're working in, and that we take positive action in reversing those inequalities, that we think about what they call intersectional greening. So the idea that green spaces and transit and other types of intervention have different meanings for different people. Spaces are interpreted differently by different communities, and we need to acknowledge all the different ways that people experience greening. And again, going back to the LA River case, people liked their park as it was. They liked their kind of informal way of getting to the river. They didn't need that new formal park. And so acknowledging those everyday practices and different identities in the community is another form of justice. And finally, relational greening is the idea of relational justice, justice across scales. Thinking about, okay, are we going to place this transit intervention, in certain communities? What happens to the ones that don't get the transit? What are the different types of access that it creates at a local level, but also at a regional level? So there are. This is really just the beginning of a new way of thinking about emancipatory anti-subordination planning, and I'm really excited to be here at the School of Cities to help us all think about how we can do this in Toronto and other cities as we grow and we adapt to climate change. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. I wanted to open up the floor or the chat to the audience questions. So please, if you have a question, please feel free to either unmute your mic or put your question into the chat.
Hi, Diane Dyson from the Canadian Urban Institute. I'll be brave. It was fascinating, the granularity that you were able to distinguish the impacts of different climate investments. And so it's absolutely most significant around parks, and that's a live debate here in the city of Toronto. I wondered, though, you had looked also at transit. Can you elaborate any more around were the impacts just not shown there, or? I just want to hear a bit more about the transit side of it.
Sure. Yeah, so transit is complicated in terms of its impacts. It actually functions very different from parks. And that's why we always say, context matters, and it kind of depends. So transit's impacts differ first of all, on basic how the station is laid out, how accessible the station is, what is the walkability around the station, are there crosswalks, is it multimodal, are there bike and ped and auto facilities that are connected as well. And so that's one kind of very highly local factor you have to think about, but then you also have to think about where the transit, what are the new accessibilities it's creating. And because that, it's all, as our Robert Cervera's work has shown us, it's all about the destination. So in the end, if you're building a new transit line and then suddenly and this is true, of course, of what the city of Toronto is doing right now, right? So you're creating an extension of the subway lines that is then creating new accessibility in those neighborhoods. So suddenly you're going to be able to get to downtown in 30 minutes where it would have taken you an hour before, right? And so that regional accessibility has huge impacts, and then changes the nature of people that will be attracted to buy and live in those neighborhoods. So transit is a very powerful shaper of neighborhood change.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Diane.
So again, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in with a question, or feel free to drop it into the chat. Irene, please.
I had two questions. Excuse me. One was with the low income, the people that moved out, were you able, did you know like where they went? Did they go to equivalent housing, better housing, no housing? Like, is it possible they were actually became homeless after they left, particularly for like low income or rental?
Absolutely. So this is not, we didn't do this in this study that I showed you today, but we have looked at this in our work, so this is what happens when you have a forced move. And we found this for very low income people, low income and moderate income people too. If your move is not by choice, you are most likely to go to a neighborhood where people are not as well off as where you came from. In other words, they're downward moves generally. And so for those extremely low income people, at 30% median income or below, absolutely, there is likely to be a homelessness impact. But one of the things, however, that our models showed here and elsewhere is that group was actually the least likely to move out. And we believe that is because many are already in permanently subsidized housing, so they're protected when that new transit line or park, whatever, comes in. So even though we do find that impacts are small, it doesn't mean that we don't have to take action, and we want to mitigate all forms of displacement because the people that have to move out are likely to be worse off.
So my second question, which I don't know if you can really answer or not. So I'm in York region, and I'm close to where they're proposing the GTA West Highway. And there's other people that are really, there's been a lot of things forced on communities under the current provincial government that don't really seem to support any kind of climate justice or many other things. And it's been done in a way, very aggressive legislation changes. And the people who are being consulted definitely do not feel like we're getting good data or transparency. And I know this goes into the realm of political, but it's really overwhelming. Like, how do communities deal with that kind of government, or when that change is forced upon them? I don't know if you had any thoughts.
It is overwhelming. I think, I don't think we're really going to make progress on climate change unless our governments get better aligned and then themselves align better with communities. We're going to have really much better buy-in across population. There are many surveys showing, everybody supports transit as long as the other guy rides it, right? So and then also, the California progress on climate change, the hundreds of billions of dollars in this portfolio only comes about because the state legislator and the government and the mayors of the big cities are all from the same party. They're all Democrats, and it was not until that happened that everything, all the stars aligned and things moved ahead. So all I can say is get out there and vote if there are elections next year. There's some.
It sounds like there were some questions in the chat here, and it sounds like your get out and vote may have addressed some of these, but I'm curious. There's one question here that says, there are reasons why gentrification may be justified for green development or transit. What can communities do to address gentrification in their areas?
So yeah, a lot of it is about kind of understanding the change that is going on and engaging in it. And it's very hard to actually stop the onslaught of gentrification. So, but what we can do as a community, first of all, is we can patronize our local businesses and support our local schools and make sure that they have the ability to stay, the businesses in particular. But then secondly, I think I think in Toronto there is not enough of a movement yet to stem displacement. There's not really that I can see a concerted effort in terms of anti-displacement policy. There are many different fragmented efforts, but what we learned in the Bay Area, the Bay Area lesson in San Francisco was that you can't just build new housing. You have to preserve your affordable housing stock that you have there already. And so so we have housing programs which are really geared towards boosting the housing supply, and that's great. We need new housing too, but that cannot be everything. When the cost of building a unit, when the labor costs are going up, when the supply chains are not working, we really need to think about preserving the affordability that we have already. I note tonight there is a forum on legalizing rooming houses, and rooming houses are a brilliant way to provide affordability, and and so we should obviously make them safe and livable, but providing a path to legality and then preventing the conversion of rooming houses and other types of multifamily housing to single family McMansions is really important role that we should be paying. And then there's tenant protections as well, and making sure that we advocate for strong just cause ordinances so that people cannot simply get evicted without cause.
Since some communities are not familiar with or comfortable with data analytics tools, how do you reach out and encourage local communities to use the urban displacement tool?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I've noticed is that a lot of the people using our tools and our maps are younger, like the man I showed you in the slide, and actually we get a huge amount of traffic from high school students who are very interested, and from all kinds of communities. So I get an inquiry every day from somewhere around the world from that website. We have 12,000 users each month, and so obviously putting something up on the web can get you a long ways. But I think there's much to be done, and this is where I hope institutions like the school cities come in, because we ought to be making sure that people understand maps, that they understand data, that they know how to create their own visualizations and know how to use the data to support their own causes, to support spatial justice. And so, hopefully we will, provide some of that capacity building at the school.
That's great. Yeah, no, we, as we learned when we spoke to the federal minister of infrastructure, there's a desire for youth to be engaged in these processes. It's not always the sexiest topic, but the more people realize their role in infrastructure, the more they can really change their communities. But there is often the question of NIMBYism as an obstruction to some of these developments and some of this progress. Any strategies that you've seen or any advice you have when some of these progressive changes are being obstructed by NIMBYism?
Yeah, NIMBYism is a really tough one, and the studies on it are showing pretty definitively who the NIMBYs are and who these people are that show up at the public hearings over and over again, and we're understanding now that they are wealthy, affluent, often retired homeowners that have the capacity to fight new development. And that's not to say that, I mean, there are other types of NIMBYs, but the preponderance are people that are privileged. Figuring out how to slow that down is very tricky when these are very, very resourced people. One